The health of ocean habitats are a delicate balance of the presence of the right species and the proper oceanographic conditions. When these things are out of balance, the health of habitats can be at stake. Coral reef habitats act as a host to a diversity amount of species of invertebrates and vertebrates, like fish for vertebrates and shrimp and crabs and so forth as invertebrates. However, the reefs are sensitive to physical and chemical changes, which we've often discussed on the podcast. But we rarely discuss the biological changes that can occur, including the presence of predators and prey, or even their absence. So in this episode of the Speak Up for the Ocean Blue podcast, we're going to talk about an interesting article out of Forbes magazine, or Forbes.com, I should say, that reveals a decline, looks at a study that reveals a decline of reef sharks that could affect the health of coral reefs. We're going to talk about that on today's episode of the How to Protect the Ocean podcast. Let's start the show. Hey everybody, welcome back to another exciting episode of the How to Protect the Ocean podcast. I'm your host, Andrew Lewin. This is the podcast where you find out what's happening in the ocean, how you can speak up for the ocean, and what you can do to live for a better ocean by taking action. On today's episode, we're going to be talking about sharks, the presence and absence of sharks on coral reefs. So we're talking about specifically reef sharks and how important they can be to coral reefs, and how a new study in Nature Communications found that there's been a decline in the amount of reef sharks around the world's coral reefs, which could have implications for reef health, which, like I said in the pre-intro, we don't normally discuss. So I want to discuss that today because I think it's really important. But before I get to that, just a quick shout out to a program that I've built. It's called How to Build Your Ocean Career. This program is a private podcast. It's a premium podcast where I release weekly episodes, and you find out how you can build a career in ocean conservation. This is a thing that I've been doing for a while. I've been working with people for the last 8 years on how to get a job in ocean conservation, how to do the proper application, how to do the right cover letter and the resume, how to look for the right jobs and so forth that fit your needs and build a career that you want, not the career that is given to you based on the job that you get, the career that you want, and making sure that you're happy throughout that career. I know it's not easy. I've been through it before. I was able to find a career that I like and even build my own path, and it's something that I really love to do. So I've built a program. It's an audio podcast, a private podcast that is updated weekly. You pay monthly. It's $5 a month, and you can get access to my advice. You can also get access to job ads that I go through, and I just talk about how I think it should be, how I would apply for it if I had those qualifications. So check it out. If you go to speakupforblue.com. That's speakupforblue.com/career. Speakupforblue.com/career. You can sign up for it, and you can cancel at any time. And you can stay on the program as long as you want, as long as you need. But I would love to hear your thoughts on that. So feel free to contact me by DM me on Instagram at How to Protect the Ocean. Anyway, let's get back into the show. This is an episode or an article I'm covering called Most Coral Reef Sharks and Rays May Be at Risk of Extinction. It's written by a good friend of mine, Melissa Cristina Marquez. And so this is something, she's on Forbes.com. She writes, I believe, weekly. She writes about the latest and exciting research on sharks worldwide. So I highly recommend that you check that out. But today we're going to be talking about the article that she talked about, or that she wrote about, which is a new study in Nature Communications. And it builds on a study in 2020 that found that reef sharks across the globe are in decline, missing from 19% of the world's coral reefs. And so at the time, back in 2020, this was the greatest decline of reef sharks ever recorded, but the recent results suggest that the extinction of coral reef sharks and rays as a percentage of threatened species is almost double that of all 1,199 known shark and ray species. So finding a highlight. So this is a quote from the article. It said, the findings highlight the need for immediate conservation action for these species through local protections, fisheries management and enforcement, and marine protected areas. That's what the authors are stressing as sort of like the overall finding. So let's talk about coral reefs. We know that, we've talked about how they have a range, right? That's very particular to what they like to be healthy. And so that range is predicated on a specific pH, usually around 8.2, 8.3, a specific temperature, especially sunlight conditions. The water pollution has to be low or next to nothing, because if not, it'll overgrow with algae. So low nitrates, low ammonia levels. And so it's very particular in the way it builds. They even have to have a certain amount of calcium available so that the coral reefs can build their calcium skeleton, their limestone skeleton. So, this is something we've known for a while. We've covered on the podcast a lot, but we haven't covered a ton on sharks, reef sharks in coral reefs. And this is something that I feel like is really important, because if anybody's gone diving on a coral reef in the tropics, you've seen probably a reef shark at some point, whether it's a nurse shark, whether it's a black tip reef shark, a white tip reef sharks. A lot of times dive masters are like, oh, these are reef sharks. Sometimes they range anywhere between, from a few feet to, 7 or 8 feet. And they play a vital role in just controlling the predator-prey dynamic within the reef system. So they are an apex predator if they're on a reef a lot of these times, and so they will feed on prey. So it could be other fish, it could be crabs, it could be really anything that they can feed on. But what happens here is there's a delicate balance. If anybody's had a marine aquarium, at home, like a saltwater aquarium, that, obviously the chemistry matters, but when you see that your chemistry is out of whack and you get a lot of algae, right? Either the light's on too long or it's too intense. And so it kind of gets out of, and you don't have a fish that can eat the algae, right? So you need a good amount of herbivorous fish that will eat the plants, the algae that grow out of whack. And so if you don't have that, you're in trouble, right? You need to have that in order to control the level of algae, to control the level of growth of algae on the reef. There's always going to be algae on the reef, but it's not necessarily going to be present all the time, or numbers that will overgrow the corals, which provide the habitat. A lot of algae will outgrow the corals, and they will suffocate them. They will grow on top of the corals. They will compete for space, and they will usually win because they grow so quickly compared to a coral, right? And so you'll have these herbivorous fish. So if you're in a marine aquarium, you'll have like a lawnmower blenny or something like that will eat, hair algae constantly. Then you can get like hermit crabs. You can get emerald crabs. You can get all these different crabs that can help you balance the amount of algae that is in there. Obviously, you still turn off your lights and you can do other things, make sure your water chemistry is intact. But those animals will allow you will resist the change that you don't want, right? Which is an algae overgrowth. And that happens in the ocean as well, just on a larger level. You have herbivorous fish and so forth. But here's the thing. The ocean and coral reef habitat is a very big food web. It's something that you have to, that it has to be balanced. And so if you have a fish that's a predator for herbivorous fish and they are out of whack, then what's going to happen is those herbivorous fish will decline in number, and then the algae will outgrow the corals, right? Because there's nothing there eating them. Right. And that's like, I'm not talking just one species. You want many species of herbivorous fish that are there. And so that can be a big problem. However, if you have sharks that eat, or some other predator that eat the fish that eat the herbivorous fish, now you're balancing, right? Because you're balancing the predators of the herbivorous fish with sharks. And so the sharks can maintain that level. But if the sharks start declining because of overfishing, then we have problems here. The food web is out of whack. And so that becomes a big mess for the coral reef. So this is what is meant by when Christina uses, or Melissa, uses the headline, most coral reef sharks and rays may be at risk of extinction, and the coral health may be at risk, is because the lack of apex predators, or a decline of apex predator, can actually affect the overall coral reef health just through that example. There are probably other examples that I'm missing here, but that's a major example of what can happen when we start losing sharks on a coral reef. And the reason why we're losing sharks on a coral reef, I kind of mentioned, is overfishing. Right, there are people who are fishing out sharks and rays. Sorry, this is not just sharks, but sharks and rays, because for their meat, right? For their meat, for their fins, for everything. A lot of these places are small villages. Sometimes they're bigger areas, but they're catching sharks because sharks will go for the bait. They're aggressive and they're meaty, and they work well, right? That you can always get a good meal out of a shark. And then you can sell the rest of the pieces or give the rest of the pieces to the rest of the village. And this is also happening on larger scales as well. But if you want to manage your coral reef and you want to have a sustainable coral reef and a sustainable habitat, you need to put in protections. And that's why in this article, they're calling for protections, not only in marine protected areas, but fisheries management and also enforcement. And that goes with, when you have fisheries management and you have marine protected areas, they provide sort of on paper, this is what we need to protect. And if it's implemented properly, then there's an enforcement aspect on this. And a lot of times that looks like, it doesn't necessarily look like a police force or some kind of like Coast Guard force, but in a lot of these small villages, it's managed by the community. The community has a goal, and that goal is to make sure that the coral reef and the surrounding areas of the ocean that they depend on will actually feed them and provide them with resources. And they're very, very dedicated to protecting those resources. So if they want those resources to continue, they will go after and they will say, yes, I want these resources. I'm going to fix this. I'm going to go for this, right? And so we're going to do anything we can. So we're going to do the management. That management is going to say, okay, as a community, we're going to police people and make sure they're not taking too many sharks. Make sure that there's only a certain amount of sharks that they can take per year, per catch, or whatever that might be. And they're the ones who are going to enforce it. But enforcement is exceptionally important, especially when you get into larger areas that are harder to cover. That's when you depend on your coast guards and on your fisheries implementation, your fisheries enforcement, like in the States, in Canada, in bigger countries where you can actually say, hey, this is what we need. But they're also dependent on villages within that to say, hey, we got to make sure that we're protecting our environment. We're protecting our coral reef. So that becomes a big part of this entire thing. If we want to manage threatened species properly, we want to manage sharks properly, which will manage our habitats, we will put those policies in place and put the enforcement that goes along with it. So that's the episode. It's a short and sweet one here for Monday. I want to kind of jump on this new study because I think it's extremely important. Threatened species, sharks are threatened. Many of them are going extinct. But when you talk about coral reefs and how important they are to coral reefs and how important coral reefs are to us and the ocean is to us, we need to really act on this and act on this fast. And by identifying that coral reef sharks are in decline, we can maybe focus in the management on these reefs areas, right? So imagine like the Great Barrier Reef. I mean, that's probably the largest barrier reef in the world, and it's got a huge marine park, right? It's a conglomerate of different managed areas for different things, different uses. So some of them are towards, sorry, I lost my train of thought. Some of them are more towards, recreational, so like fishing diving and snorkeling. Others are more for fishing. Others are for you can't take anything. Others are for research. There's a lot of different ocean uses out there, and so they have just this speckled not mismanagement, but these different managed areas for different uses, and so those help. They kind of readmit it, like they. I'm trying to think of the words. I'm totally lost on words right now. But they reaffirm why we need help and how to manage those areas. But when we're looking at sharks in those coral reef areas, that's where the research will come in. And that's where we can start to take advisement on how many coral reef sharks are in the area. Is that increase? Has that decreased? How do we increase it? How do our policies need to change to increase those sharks and enforcement, of course. So that's the episode for today. I'd love to hear your thoughts. Have you been part of studies, or do you know any studies, or what are your thoughts on this study that talks about decline of sharks and the need to protect these sharks on coral reefs and manage maybe even the coral reef habitat as a habitat, but in that have fisheries management and protect these sharks, and maybe start focusing on the apex predators of these coral reefs to help rebuild or to help maintain the status quo. So I'd love to hear from you. You can DM me at How to Protect the Ocean. That's at How to Protect the Ocean. Or you can go to speakupforblue.com. You can click on the Contact Us page, send me an email. I'd love to hear from you. And that's it for today's episode of How to Protect the Ocean. Thank you so much for listening. I'm your host, Andrew Lewin. Have a great day. We'll talk to you next time, and happy conservation.